Hi everyone, welcome to episode 12 of ARM Template Masterclass. This week we're not writing any code, but we're going to have a look at how do you actually find the resources and properties you need to use in your ARM template. If you've looked at an ARM resource, there are lots and lots of different properties. They are often not named in perhaps the most intuitive way for you to understand what those properties are, or to be able to find out what the actual values you need to put in those properties are to make the resource do what you want. And so today we're going to have a look at the tools and resources I use to be able to find those properties and resource types and so on, and use them in my templates. So hopefully you'll finish this lesson with a whole load of new resources you can use when you're trying to build those new complex templates and you just can't find the property you need to make it work. So the first tool I tend to use is one we've already looked at, which is the Snippets functionality in the Resource Manager extension for VS Code. By using these snippets, you get a resource that has been configured with most of the properties you actually might want. It will also often tell you what the values are available for a particular property as well and give you the choice to select those. So sometimes you can get all the information you need just from using the snippets. So if we go back to our old trusted favorite, the storage account, and I'll create one using a snippet here. And you can see it's created the properties I need to be able to create that storage account, and it's put some values in them. Now some of these properties have preset values that I can choose from. And so the snippet does actually give me the choice of what those values are. So if we tab onto the kind property, here I have a number of options that I can choose, but they're all pre-configured. And so the snippet will actually show me the choices I have available that I can actually select. And so I don't need to go and find out what those values are. They're already in the snippet. The same thing with the tier. This will show me the options I've got. So using the snippet, I can get those properties and values for a basic storage account without having to leave the editor. However, a lot of the snippets in the extension are configured to create a resource with its most common properties. Take the storage account, for example. This will create you a working storage account, but a number of the properties that are available on the storage account are not shown here, mainly to keep it simple and to give you the most used properties. If you want to amend things further, so maybe you want to do something like turn off encryption for some reason, or enable non-HTTPS traffic. These are not things that people want to do very often, so they're not in the snippet, but those properties are available. And so if you want to find out what those are, we have to look at some other resources. So the next place we can look is the official Microsoft documentation. Every ARM resource is documented with its schema, which tells you all of the properties that that resource has and the type of value they can accept. You'll find that when you look at the schema documentation that there are multiple different schema versions, as you might expect, as new ones have been created as we go along. So you need to make sure that you're looking at the right schema version. So in this example here, we've got the storage account schema, and in the API version dropdown, you can see there's a whole load of different versions. We need to select the one that we are actually using in our template. Once we've done that, it will show us the template format, which gives us a layout of how all those properties sit and the values they accept. And then if we scroll down, we can look at the actual property values, and it will give us a description of those values and some information about what those values can be. And these values are split into the different objects that sit inside the resource. So if we take our storage account, for example, if we want to know what different SKU options there are, so the different premium, standard, LRS, GRS, those sort of things, then we can see from the actual JSON schema here that this information sits inside a SKU object. And so if we scroll down, we can find that object in the documentation, and you can see it's got two properties, the name and the tier, and we can see what options are available to be used by those. So for the name section, we've got standard LRS, GRS, RAGRS, and so on. And then for tier, we have standard or premium. So those gives us the values of those properties we can set. We can also see whether they're required or not. So the Microsoft documentation has pretty much all the information you need to be able to find the properties and values you want to use in your resources. However, personally, I find I learn these things much better if I can look at an example rather than just looking at plain listed text of describing the resources. So what I also tend to use is a number of different resources that will be allowing me to look at examples of real resources that are being deployed. So the first place we can look for real world examples is the Azure Quick Start Templates GitHub Repo. So this is a repository that Microsoft created that has lots and lots of examples of ARM templates that you can create. So there are simple examples like here's how you create a storage account, but there are also more complex things like here's how you create a storage account and then have a batch account use that storage account. All the way up to some really complicated deployments, like deploying a Jenkins cluster using VMSS with blue-green deployment. So there can be some really complicated examples in here as well if you're looking for something like that. Looking at the repo, first off, a lot of the resources have been categorized with a number indicating how complex they are. So 101 being the more simple ones, 201 being medium, and 301 being the more complicated side of things. You'll also find that there are a number of resources that don't have numbering on them. I'm not sure why this is the case there, whether they've dropped that approach or whether they just haven't got around to classifying them. But you'll also find other resources in here that have not been numbered, but that are also useful. So there really is a huge amount of examples in this repository. So often you can find an example where somebody has done something exactly like you want. And you can have a look at that. You just go into the example, it shows you the templates like we've got here. And a lot of them are actually ready to be deployed as they stand. So you could download them and run them yourself, or even you could use the deploy to Azure button that a lot of them have to actually go and deploy those resources straight from the templates in those GitHub repos. So if you can find an example of what you're trying to do in here, which is quite likely given the amount of examples there are, then this should give you a real working example that you can have a look at, you could even try out, and hopefully will give you what you need. However, if you don't find an example of what you need, or the information you need is missing or out of date, some of them can be a little out of date, they're not always updated as frequently as perhaps I would like, then we need to look at some other places to get this information. So if none of the options we've talked about so far have given you the information you need, then the next place I would look is actually trying to look at a live resource that's configured the way you want it to see those properties. So the first step of this is to actually create a resource and configure it the way you want. Generally, you're going to want to do this using the portal, because you can then configure that however you wish, and you'll see all the options in the portal. Obviously, that doesn't help you automate it. This gets us a resource in a state that we're interested in, that we can then use some other tools to go and have a look at that resource's ARM template and figure out what the properties we're interested in are. So once we've created the resource, there are two places we can go to see the actual JSON that forms that resource. The first one is using the portal. So for any resource that you create in the Azure portal, if you click on that resource, on the left-hand side in the settings section, you will find an export template option. And if you click on this, it will show you an ARM template that has been generated, which you can actually take away and use to deploy that resource. And so this template should be configured with all the properties that you have configured on your resource, and allow you to have a look at those and find out what those values and properties are. So again, here we've got a storage account that I created previously, and if we click on the export template section, we'll get this ARM template, and in there you can see all the properties. So we can have a look. Again, we've got that SKU object with standard GRS and standard tier, and we can see all the other properties that have been configured for this storage account. Now, one thing to bear in mind when you look at a real object, you'll find that there are a lot of properties in here that you probably didn't set. This is usually going to be because these have been taken as defaults when you created the object. So either you didn't make a choice, or a choice wasn't available to you in the portal, and it's been configured with a default option. The template that the portal creates for you should be deployable as it stands. However, you do need to take that with a bit of a pinch of salt, because the templates this generates can be a little bit verbose. Particularly any option where there is a choice you can make, it will often create a parameter for. And so you can end up with templates with a very, very long list of parameters. Even if some of those you don't actually want to set, you want to create the default, or perhaps you want to use a variable or something to set those. So a really common example of this is the name for resources. If you export a template where it has multiple different resources, every one of them needs a name, it will create a parameter for each of those names. Now, quite often when I'm creating templates, I don't name each resource individually. I'll pass in some sort of prefix or naming convention, which I'll then use to create the names in line using some functions as part of the template. So if you want to take a template from the portal, you will probably need to take that and adjust it to make it slightly less verbose and make it work better for what you're going to use. Another tool I use for this is something that a lot of people don't know about, which is the Azure Resource Explorer. So if you go to resources.azure.com, you can see this Resource Explorer tool, which is just a way you can actually look through your resources and get the JSON data for them. It's not like the portal with a fancy UI or anything. It is just basically a tree view of all your resources, and you can find your way through it and go have a look at those resources. You can also actually send commands using the REST API through this to amend or create resources as well. I primarily use it for viewing the resources, but it does have that functionality. So for example, if we have a look here, we're going to expand our subscription and our resource groups and find the resource group we used in last week's show, episode 11. We expand that. If you remember, we created a key vault. So we can see under the key vault provider that we've got our episode 11 key vault. And if we click on that, we can see the JSON that represents that object. Now this is slightly different to what you saw in the portal. What you had in the portal was a generated template that allows you to create that resource. What you're seeing in Resource Explorer is the actual resource that exists in Azure. So you'll notice there are a number of properties in here that may not be listed in documentation or that you may not have seen before and you can't set. These are because these are properties that are set by the ARM fabric when you create the resource. So just looking at this key vault object, we've got a couple right at the top. We have an ID, which is not something you can set, it's generated for you. And the same bit further down where we've got the vault URI. Again, I can't create that, that's created based on the name I give it, but it is a property of the resource that actually exists. So I find Resource Explorer a really useful tool to be able to go and browse through my resources and see what's been created and use that to be able to turn things into an ARM template. Personally, I find this more useful than the one in the portal, but both of them are useful tools to know about. You use whichever you find more useful and easier to use. So there we go. There are a number of different resources you can use to actually go and find out what the resource you're trying to deploy looks like, what properties it values it's got, and hopefully help you create a new ARM template that deploys whatever you need, configured how you need it. As always, if you've got any questions, please feel free to add them in the comments. Next week, we're going to be having a look at deployment scopes to see how you can deploy resources that exist outside of resource groups. Hopefully I'll see you then. Until next time, have a great rest of your day.